Abdulrazak Gurnah is the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature 2021. His book Afterlives was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Fiction 2021 and longlisted for the Walter Scott Prize. He was Professor of English at the University of Kent and was a Man Booker Prize judge in 2016. Alexandra Pringle was Editor-in-Chief of Bloomsbury for 20 years. She's been awarded honorary degrees of Doctor of Letters from Anglia Ruskin and Warwick Universities. Over to both of you.
Thank you so much. I am incredibly happy to be here this morning, on this stage with Abdulrazak Gurnah, because I have had the great honor and joy of being his publisher for more than 20 years. He came to Bloomsbury Publishing with his novel By the Sea, and we have been together ever since. And so today, we're going to talk about his life and his work so that you can learn a little bit more about this man sitting beside me, who, to the greatest joy of my whole working life, won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2021. So, Abdulrazak, I would like to begin at the beginning with your childhood in Zanzibar. Tell us about it. You were born in 1948 in this little island.
Hi. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your introduction. Childhood. Childhood is, I think, wherever it is, probably has a kind of innocence for most people, of course. Completion about it, because you know so little. You have a little world, parents, friends, the street where you play, and this kind of thing. So the earliest memories of childhood is really like being walked to the first day at school, or being inoculated, or something like that. But most of it was fine, was great. It was just felt so safe and so secure. It's only later that you begin to see just how fortunate you were both to be in a place like Zanzibar, and also to be so okay, enough to eat, friends, etc. All of those things that not everybody has.
And you grew up, and it was a port. Tell us a little about the sea.
Yes, well, it's a small island, but if you look at it on the map, you'll see it's beautifully positioned. It's very close to the continent, but the reason it's so beautifully positioned is because the musim, the monsoon winds, kind of come more or less directly across the Indian Ocean to Zanzibar. And the currents also. So you could, if you were a moderately skillful sailor, you could launch your boat from more or less Western India, Southern Arabia, Somalia, at the right time of the year, and it would deliver you to Zanzibar. And so for centuries, we had these people, travelers from all these different parts of the Indian Ocean, coming to Zanzibar during the months of November and December, when the northeast monsoons blow our way. After 3 months or so, the winds change. They could again launch their boats and go home. And so year after year, we had these visitors from different parts of the ocean, some of whom stayed. Many of them didn't, and sometimes they even took some of the people from there, either as people they kidnapped to go and work for them, or in some cases people they had become affectionate to and fallen in love with and take them to some other part. But in this process, what actually happened was that they left things behind: their languages, their religions, their cuisines, etc. So what you do have now along that east coast of Africa is this beautifully complex culture and language. So our language is Swahili, for example, and what that actually means is the language of the coast in Arabic. So there are a lot of Arabic words, the Hindi words, the Portuguese words, because they called on us briefly as well, on their way to India, of course.
And your father spoke Arabic, though?
Yes, he spoke Arabic, he spoke Swahili, and sometimes he thought he spoke French, but he didn't really.
And tell us about the language for you that you read in as a child and then later.
Yeah, well, Swahili was the language both at home as well as at school. We learnt English, but in a very kind of casual way. It was rather curious. Our colonial education was peculiar. I don't think it was unique, but it was nonetheless peculiar in that until the age of about 12 and 13, all teaching was in Kiswahili. But if you were fortunate enough to go to secondary school, which in those days was not as easy as all that, because there were so few secondary schools, then all the teaching there was in English. So you really had to get your game up if you did get to secondary school. And it was very puzzling suddenly to have to, to understand enough. The reason all the teaching in secondary school was in English was because all the teachers in secondary school were Europeans. Somehow they didn't think us natives could teach in secondary schools. And they couldn't speak Swahili, so it meant the teaching was in English.
And then in 1964, the revolution happened. And what happened to your life then?
Yeah, well, we started by me saying how secure everything felt as a child, and that was true. So I guess what it means is that there was a certain naivety about that security, not really understanding the way that in the process of campaigning for decolonization, politics had become racialized in a very violent way. So in 1964 there was an uprising, which was the losing party in the elections just before independence decided that they'd had enough of this democracy stuff, and they decided to overthrow the government, and they succeeded. And the result of that was many, many years. They're still there, by the way. The result of that was many, many years of authoritarian rule, imprisonments, people being expelled, etc. But from my point of view, I suppose, aside from the other, any of those things would have affected me, if not directly, then perhaps because members of my family, my uncle, for example, was imprisoned, etc. But more directly, there was no possibility of studying any further. And to me, at the age of 18, that seemed unbearable.
One of the things I think is so interesting about Abdulrazak's writing is that, as the Nobel Committee said, he writes about refugees and asylum, but it's very, very much more than that. It's the different winds that can blow people across continents and countries, and they can be so many different reasons. It can be economics, politics, love, and in your case, education was one of the winds that blew you.
Yeah, well, that was the kind of the impetus or the impulse. But of course, nobody wants to live in a climate of terror and fear and so on. But I was 18, and at 18 you think, well, I'm not putting up with this. In a way that perhaps if you're in your 30s and you have responsibilities and whatever, then you would consider more carefully. But I think at 18 there's a kind of recklessness that says, no, I'm going, like that. And of course you don't realize until after you've gone just what you have actually done, and that it isn't as simple as going to study or something like that.
And you landed in England in the 1960s, which was quite a grim place.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was at a time when I think this great panic about migration, immigration, was at a kind of at a climax. All the new laws that were brought in, It was 1962, 1968, and so on. So it was that period, the 60s was that period when the UK was waking up to this idea, we don't want these people, but they keep coming. Interestingly enough, actually, there were waves, weren't there? First the Caribbean, then South Asians, and I think when I arrived in England, it was more or less just before the enormous departures, I suppose, of people of South Asian ancestry from East Africa. And soon after that, there was, of course, Idi Amin's infamous expulsion of South Asians. So it was that atmosphere. And the atmosphere was kind of like shared by more or less everybody. There was pretty much a consensus of anti-foreigner, anti-brown, black foreigners in particular. I didn't know any of this. But yeah, I came into the midst of that. Some of you know about the notorious speech by Enoch Powell about rivers of blood, his predictions for what would happen if we don't stop these people from coming. And I actually heard that on the radio. Well, you know, the bit of it that they replayed on the radio. It was that kind of time.
And what was your experience of racism before you arrived in England?
I had absolutely no experience of racism. It was all a big surprise, you know. Of course, I'd read about what was going on in the United States and the civil rights movement, and I grew up with stories of apartheid in South Africa. Most of the southern part of Africa, during my childhood, was, well, you have South Africa, then you have the Portuguese in Angola, Mozambique. You had Rhodesia is a white colony. And it felt at the time as if this was not going to change in my lifetime. They all seemed so solidly there. So racism meant that to me. It meant those sorts of state policies, as it were. I didn't know that you could walk down a street and a 14 or 13-year-old kid would, you know, hurl abuse at you, or even worse. So I didn't know about things like that.
So you were there, you were poor, and you were lonely. And I often wonder, so you started to write. Tell us about how that began.
Yeah, the way I think of it is that, and I see it now when I see young people taking, you know, these terrible risks with their lives, crossing the Mediterranean, traveling for months across deserts and mountains or whatever. And I often think they're thinking of where they're going, which is also what I was doing, but they're not really thinking about what they're leaving behind. And I think for me that getting to the United Kingdom at that age was a mixture of those things. So first of all, is that sense of what have I done? And that's to do with what I've given up as much as what I've kind of landed myself into. And what I landed myself into is that I was a young, untraveled, unskilled, poor 18-year-old in this country that didn't want me. But at the same time, the need to understand that feeling of having lost, the feeling of loss and the feeling of hostility and adventure and newness, all of this, trying to work all that out. It was that I think that started me off writing. But I wasn't writing, I wouldn't probably have called what I was doing writing. It was more like working things out, trying to reflect. In other words, it was not intended for anybody to see this writing that I was doing. It was just for me to understand things. Sometimes writing helps like that. Maybe I'm sure many of you have experienced that. Even writing lists sometimes kind of clarifies things and that sort of thing. So it was more like that. And anyway, there was a kind of pleasure, all that pouring out, all that self-pity and misery and whatever. It's sometimes quite pleasurable to do that. Well, anyway, that's how it started. But then it kept growing. So at some point, I started to think, well, wait. At some point, I found myself fictionalizing it, sort of as if I'm telling somebody else's story. And when you do that, you can then invent a little bit. You can enhance or diminish or whatever. But still, none of this was intended to be writing as such. I wasn't thinking of myself as I'm going to write. But at some point, I thought maybe I could make something of this. And so it kind of grew like that. And ambition stirred.
And did that become Memory of Departure, or was that a different book?
It did eventually, yeah. It did eventually. I guess maybe over a couple of years or so of working it. And then I had a friend who was a trained typist, a secretary, and she said, give it to me, I'll type it up for you. And then it becomes something different. Instead of these pages and pages of scribbles, it's a typescript. And you think, wow, it's a book.
And what did you do with it?
Well, for a while I just hung on to it because I didn't want to tell anybody that this is what I'd done. But then in the end I did put it in the post and send it to a publisher. It came back.
And how long was it until you found a publisher?
It took a long time, yeah. It took a long time, many years. In fact, it took a very long time. But at the same time, I was also studying, and then, in fact, I think when I was revising what became Memory of Departure for the umpteenth time, I was also writing my PhD dissertation.
And what was that on?
It was on West African fiction, but mostly on the criticism. I was interested in the way certain critical ideas were becoming powerful then, and resisting some of those ideas, largely, I suppose, Afrocentric ideas, which PhDs are interesting, you see, because at the time, at certain times, if what seems to be a really burning question that you have to address, and you do, and other people probably are also doing so, then the climate changes, or this forces the climate to change. And what you've done is you've contributed to a kind of an exchange of ideas, but it's now no longer of any relevance, because the result has been that ways of thinking have moved on, have changed. Which is all right, because I think PhDs should be like that. They should be addressing, not all of them, of course, but they should be addressing issues that matter, rather than always going back to the archive and so on. But, everybody has their own choices. But I do like, in my own career as an academic, I was always keen to take on researchers who wanted to talk about the world, as it were, rather than just about texts.
And your first novels were all contemporary, and then came what I think of as a watershed novel, which was Paradise, which goes back in time. And that was connected to going back to Zanzibar, is that right?
It was, yeah. Partly, as I said earlier, leaving was a decision, a big decision. Perhaps that's why it seems so traumatic in the sense of what have I done, because the only way you could leave was illegally. You left like you knew that you would not be able to go back because you'd broken the law. Nobody was allowed to leave. So I guess the reason it seemed such a loss, you think, I can't go back. But then in 1984 or so, there was an amnesty, and us criminals were allowed to go back if we wanted to. So I took that opportunity. There was a leak in the roof of the flat we were then living in. For some reason or another, we managed to persuade the insurance company to pay, I think it was £600, to have this roof repaired. So I stuffed various newspapers into the leak and used the £600 to buy a ticket, and went back to Zanzibar. So that was 17 years.
Your family must have been overjoyed.
Yeah, they were. I wasn't sure if they would be, but they were.
And so tell us a little bit, I think your historical fiction is so interesting about the periods of history, and in a way I think Paradise and Afterlives, they're almost sequels, although they have different people, but they're a continuation of a piece of history.
Yes, sure. One of the things that I saw when I went back, my father was still alive, although he actually passed away the following year. But anyway, he was still alive. He was quite old, in his 80s. And I remember watching him crossing from our house to go to the mosque and thinking, first of all, gosh, he's really old. He's walking so slowly and all this kind of thing. And then I thought, remember, this was 1984. So then I thought, he's about 81, I think, at that time. He would have been a child in around about 1910 or so. So he would have been present, as it were, at the time when European colonialism was taking a grip on our part of the world, because it came to us quite late, unlike to you lot. So that interested me. That what would it have seemed like to somebody like him, a child of 8 or 9 or something like that, seeing the world changing in front of you, seeing strangers coming and, taking a hold of your culture and society and making you do things in a different way. So that was the first, I suppose, the first idea behind Paradise, that moment of encounter with European colonialism and the implications, the consequences, which I started to think about. Of course, Paradise wasn't published till another 10 years from that moment that I'm describing. And many things happened in 10 years, both in terms of thinking things through. But that was one of the things I was thinking about. So, I think when I got back, I started to write what I thought was going to be the beginning of this novel. By then I had written 2 novels, none of them published yet at that point, but optimism was there, so I just thought I'd write another one. And so I wrote what I thought was going to be the beginning, which was thinking about the war in 1914, 1918, and the recruitment drive of the German army, the colonial mercenary army. So I wrote this paragraph or so, or a couple of pages, I can't remember. And then I left that for several years, until I think about 1989, when I went back for a long trip, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, I can't remember, and traveled in different parts. By then I was teaching at the University of Kent. I'd already published 2 novels. So the world looked very different at that time. Anyway, so I came back from that trip and I just started writing Paradise. But now I found that paragraph about the recruitment drives that I'd written there, that what I'd been thinking about is how did we get there? How did this young man, why is he volunteering to become a mercenary in a colonial army? So then I had to go back and kind of try and tell the story, which now became, so the recruitment drive became the final paragraph of the novel rather than the first paragraph of the novel. The link with Afterlives is that, so that was 94, but so I went on, I did other things, wrote other books, but I think I was still wanting to write about that conflict, that 1914-1918 conflict. I realized also that at that time I probably didn't know enough to do that, but in 2018, I felt that I did know enough to be able to do it. So then I wrote Afterlives. So they are truly quite connected, because I wanted to reflect on what would have happened to somebody who did become a colonial mercenary, like the young man in Paradise, but not necessarily a sequel in that direct way, but somebody like him. What would have happened to them? Well, that's one part of the novel anyway. Novels are always more than one thing.
And your novel Desertion is an even earlier piece of East African history.
Yeah, sure. Again, there I was interested in the idea of I suppose, mixed relationships between, shall we say, a European man and Swahili woman, an African woman. When I say Swahili, I have to correct, you see, because I spoke earlier about a kind of a complicated, complex, mixed cultures and races as well. So people of the coast are called Waswahili, which means literally people of the coast. So she's this woman. I wanted to write about that because I felt it was something that's generally kind of suppressed, particularly in the colonial narrative. It's as if those kinds of relationships didn't happen. Or if they did, they're made to seem exotic or, Pocahontas stuff, that kind of thing. Rather than perhaps secretive or difficult or something. And their consequences, what happens to the children of these relationships? Or indeed, what happens to these relationships themselves? Do the men stay? Or do they leave and abandon these women who become, kind of casual wives or mistresses or something? So that was the thinking behind it, yeah.
And you have the theme of mixed relationships in your contemporary novels as well. Is that something that's interested you?
Yes, well, I suppose I have a little bit of experience of that myself. So yeah, it does interest me, and also it's one of the contemporary realities, really, I suppose, of living in a place like the UK, where there is a great deal more of that, of people coming together like that, and indeed having families and so on. So it's part of our reality in a way to try and understand.
And have you experienced, because on one hand you've been a very successful academic, and on the other hand a novelist over a really long period of time, producing these extraordinary novels one after another, have you found a tension in that, or has it worked for you?
No, it worked perfectly, actually. Even to the point of that I knew that I hardly ever did my university work at home. I went to my office more or less whenever I could to do that, and I only ever wrote fiction at home. So I knew this: if I was at home, I'm writing fiction. So it didn't bother me, and nor did it. Well, I mean, there's such different kinds of writing. Writing an academic paper from writing fiction, that's just so different that there was not ever, in my mind, any conflict between the two. And to some extent, they kind of overlapped. Because I was teaching literature, I would often be thinking with admiration, let's say, about, not always, but at times, with admiration about a text that I'm discussing with students, and perhaps thinking, oh, that's really clever, that's very good. Look, how did he do that? How did she do that? Or something like that. Which doesn't necessarily mean that I think, okay, next time I write a book, I'm going to do just that. But it is still, gives you an insight, I think, gave me an insight, I thought, because I'm a writer, and I know the difficulty of producing this effect or that effect, and to see how that is done, maybe it helped.
And who are the writers who have had the most profound effect on you?
I don't know, it comes and goes, over a lifetime of reading. There's so many books. At times you think there are writers I admired that I now find really I can't read them anymore. So it's hard to tell. But I also like to think that I worked hard at not being influenced, if you see what I mean. Trying hard to maintain a kind of distinctive voice of my own, as it were. So if I did feel that this sounds like so and so, then I would probably change it, so it didn't sound like so and so. But of course, there are many writers I admired, many, and some of them. It was an interesting thing actually when I retired from the university, because one of the things that happens if you're a teacher of literature, and I'm sure there are some here, is that you accumulate a lot of books as part of your work. And so the office is sort of like there were something like 20 boxes, because these days when you retire, off you go. You take your books and leave. Unlike in the days when I was a student, where the professor would be able to kind of hang on to the office for another 5 years, and nobody would dare say, look, you've retired now, please go. But we don't get that kind of treatment anymore. So there you go, 20 boxes of books, and they're all delivered to the house. I don't have a house that's big enough to accommodate this, as well as me, as well as Denise. So these books had to go. So it was an interesting exercise to say, all right, what is the criteria for selecting which go and which don't go? So I thought to myself, which book am I going to reread? And this will be the criteria. And that was a good test to say which books are important, which writers are important to me. In some cases, I was wrong, because in some cases when I think, okay, I'll keep this one, then because I'll reread it, and I read 5 pages and I think, no, maybe not, go in that box. But that was a way of I guess, of testing which writers are valuable to me.
And you're being discreet about which ones they were.
Well, I don't mind saying. I mean, I kept all my Dickens novels, for example. So there you go. I admire very much the work of J.M. Coetzee, but many others. Sometimes just the one book, not of Coetzee, but sometimes it's a writer. I just might keep one book because the others can all go, but I'll keep that. There's too long a list, but they're there.
And we must throw it open to questions. So if you would like to put your hands up, there is a woman standing, waving her arm. No, it's you. If there a microphone. Do we have a microphone?
Yes. Volunteers are reaching with microphones. It's slightly a bit crowded at the moment. Please bear with us for a moment. Thank you.
Okay. Should we go on and talk for a little bit longer? You've got the microphone.
You point out to the person.
Okay, she was standing, waving in black.
On the exactly.
A woman standing,
Fifth
waving.
row.
She's waving. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. Hello, sir. So I have a small question, but before that, I'd like to share this with you that I have the honor of doing my PhD on your works, and I'm looking at your works through a post-colonial perspective. So coming to my question is that while reading your works, I couldn't help but notice that many of the names of your protagonists and many other characters, they are the same that we find in Bible and in Quran. So like Yusuf, Suleiman, Dawood. So I was curious, was this biblical connection or this Quranic connection, is this coincidental or is the connection much deeper? Thank you.
It's simple because quite a lot of the stories told in the Quran, the stories as opposed to the other things, of course it isn't all stories, are very similar, or variations of the stories in Judaism as well as the stories in Christianity. The same figures appear. They may be inflected sometimes in different ways, but you see the same people going through those actions, those now mythicized actions. So Dawood, David, Yusuf, Joseph, etc. So it's not any kind of, it's not a deliberate attempt to connect the two. It's just as those are the names that people were given.
Thank you. One here, woman in the front standing up. Yeah.
Hello, sir, and I'm very grateful to be here listening to you. My question is, what is your secret of writing? How do you write so well? I want to know if there's a secret ingredient.
We all want to know that.
Well, you're very kind. There is no secret. It's just trying to be clear about what it is that I'm thinking about, And of course, the great pleasure of writing is having an idea and then trying to make it happen, as it were, trying to enact it, dramatize it, or whatever, and then trying again and again until the moment arrives and you think, yes, I think this is okay, this is all right like this.
I think that one of the most remarkable things about Abdulrazak's writing is the subtlety of it and the lack of showiness, which is, I think, the hardest kind of writing to achieve. And it often looks like the easiest, but it's actually the most difficult. So I think you must have a very good inner ear.
Well, thank you for that too. But yeah, I mean, it does seem to me that when it's right, you can hear it. Yeah, it does. It's almost like, I heard somebody the other day commenting and kind of in a way that was sort of slightly skeptical. So he thinks he can hear, so not about me, about somebody else. He thinks he can hear the sentence as if it were a piece of music or something. But it's true. It's true. When you get it right, it's that's what I do. It's almost like you can shut your eyes and hear a voice.
And also, the novels are very much about small lives in large pieces of history. So you need to be very attentive to those lives, I think. Another question. There's one at the back with a cream jacket. Yeah. I seem to be picking all women. I wonder why.
Hello, sir. I want to know how you incorporate memory in your novels. Is it like you are creating a sense?
I'm so sorry, but we can't hear you well enough.
Okay. Now is it audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to know how you incorporate memory in your fictions. Is it, are you using it in order to create a national identity or to highlight the post-colonial effect?
Sorry, how you incorporate
memory?
Memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, I do think that that's a very crucial part of the resources. That's it. I was going to say arsenal, but that sounded a little too, ugly. So the resources, for me, the writer's resources, that memory is crucial to that. Partly it's because, as I was saying just the other day in the inaugural moment, it's a desire not to forget, because things, the things that have happened, what I've described earlier, for example, it's important to me that that those events are not forgotten. Because what often happens, particularly with authoritarian states, is a new narrative is made. A new narrative is forced on you, on people, on citizens, in order to just make everything work the way that the government or the authority wishes. So it's important, in my conception of writing or a writer, it's important not to submit to that, and therefore to keep the memory of what happened alive, to try and hang on to things that we know. So in an obvious way it's that, but also because that's experience, that's what you know. So it isn't just memory. Memory is just a word, but what you know is what kind of is your main resource if you're doing the kind of writing I'm doing anyway. So I write about what I know. In that respect, we call it memory or whatever you call it.
Thank you. There's in the second row with the black hat. It's just coming.
I just wanted to ask about empathy and how you can write about
empathy
and how you can write about characters whose lives you have never experienced, whose lives just seem so removed from your own life.
Well, imagination is one thing. And of course, people are not that different, really, from each other. And I always think that, Alexandra said I write about small people, but I write about people I know in one way or another. So it doesn't have to be exactly someone I know, but all kind of fragments of different people, something that I know. So I don't know, but I can try to imagine. I don't know what, a happy millionaire feels, for example, but I do know what somebody who's relatively broke and has worries about bills and bringing up children. I know about that. So I can do that more easily probably than imagining whatever. So I think partly it's to do with experience, what keep your eyes and ears open and understand what's going on in people's lives. And partly it's just imagine. That's what writers do.
Thank you. There's a man sitting down there in the scarf.
Yeah, hi sir, it's a very great honor to listen to you. So just my question is that, what do you think that how do your writing has enriched African literature and brought it more international? Especially, we don't know about Zanzibar before reading on your books, but now it has, we come to know a lot about it. So how do you think that your writing, your books has enriched African literature following the trend of after the J.M. Coetzee, we came to know of Africa. So how do you think you have enriched the African literature and made it more international?
I'm trying to sort of distill that to one question, because I think there are several floating around, knocking each other out. How can I make African literature more international? Is that what you're saying? I don't think that's my ambition. I'm not concerned about making the writing international. On the other hand, I think when I am writing, when I start to write, I don't have an idea of who is going to be reading this. I'm wide open to the possibility that everybody will be reading this, or anybody can read this. So in that way, it's wonderful when I get a little email from a school boy or girl in Argentina saying, I'm reading your book and I'm loving it. That's good. I'm happy about that. So I don't have this ambition, this desire to say this is African writing. I want to make it international.
We are running out of time, but I wanted to say that is perhaps the most marvelous thing that has happened with the award of the Nobel Prize in Literature, which is that when Afterlives was published a couple of years ago, there was the British edition and going out into all the territories, including India, and there was, I believe, a Turkish edition, and that was it. And now there are 50 languages and counting more his books are going out into. So I think that we can bless the Nobel for spreading these extraordinary books across the world and into different languages and different cultures, and thank heavens for them. And all the things that Abdulrazak writes about matter just as much now as they ever did, perhaps even more so. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Abdulrazak, for being here, for being at wonderful Jaipur Festival, and let's all say thank you to him.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank Abdulrazak Gurnah and Alexandra Pringle for this extremely interesting conversation. Sorry we couldn't take more questions from the audience, but sir will be available at the book signing right there. Please maintain queue. As a token of thanks from all of us, please accept this scarf, sir.